Lovely, great. And so you can see in the chat box that Doug has really helpfully put the link to our captions transcript. So if you want to read along while the evening is going, click on that link. And if you want to see captions live, you just click the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner. And you should have access to captions. Okay, great. So I'll just introduce our speakers and then we can hear from them. Okay. Oh, no. Sorry, 2 seconds. Okay. So our first speaker is going to be Natalya. And Natalya, Natalya has many years of engaging with individuals and organisations around disability rights and access for herself and other disabled people. And Natalya only took her first her first 2 cases, which were against HMRC and then her previous employer, when the situations became intolerable. And our second speaker is going to be Doug. And Doug has been a long-time campaigner around disabled people's right to access goods and services, like shops or public buildings, which included him being named as the claimant in the first Supreme Court case in his area. And Doug frequently challenges organisations using the Equality Act and other legislation over issues relating to disabled people's access, with a special focus on transport. And our third speaker is going to be Esther. And Esther was the first student to get Cambridge University to allow part-time study and was involved in setting up the Disabled Students Campaign. Esther regularly challenges service providers about disability access provision with some degree of success. Esther was the main claimant in the High Court case against the government about cost protection for people taking all kinds of discrimination cases. So I'm going to hand straight over to Natalya. I'm going to spotlight Natalya so we can all see her. But if you want to instead watch the interpreter Bernadette, then you can just click on Bernadette. Thank you.
Right, can you hear me? Brilliant. Okay, so pleased to meet you all. I'm really interested that lots of people have turned up. So I'm Natalya, I'm 40, and I grew up near Manchester in the UK. I'm someone who's had my impairment since I was born, and I was the only deaf and disabled person in my family. And I've decided to take a sort of anecdotes approach today, talking about some of my experiences and some of the things I think I've learned that I hope other people can relate to or consider learning for themselves. And one of my earliest memories is that you never get what you need as a disabled person because you need them. You've got to fight for them. You've got to advocate for them. And when I was a child, my parents wanted me educated in mainstream education. And they wanted me to have something called a statement, which is a document that basically gives you legal protections and legal rights to disability support and adjustments and so on. Now, the local authority didn't want to do this because that would have cost them money. Although actually I didn't need expensive adjustments, but we all know it's not about the cost. And so they first of all said to my parents that I wasn't eligible for a statement. But I'm severely deaf, and their policy said that all severely and profoundly deaf children had to have a statement. At which point, deciding that, oh yeah, okay, that's the policy, we'll just reclassify Natalya's level of deafness and say that she's only moderately severely deaf. And that was based on the fact that I speak too well. And that reclassification of deafness still causes me havoc 30 years later when I try and get accurate deafness brief for things. But we did get the statement and we got some support, albeit grudging. and I was able to attend the same mainstream school that my sister did. And what I see often is people deterred from their rights because authorities just blatantly lie. And so that's my first lesson. Authority will lie to you, and that's especially the case if it's a public body, which I'll come to later. Now, I was lucky that my parents didn't just do all the fighting and advocacy for me. As I got older, they started teaching me to advocate for myself. I had a computer in primary school, and this was the 1980s, where having technology in education was really rare. When it broke, the only person who was going to fix it was me or my dad, who was a computer programmer. My dad made me read the manuals, troubleshoot, keep fault logs, and when we had to go to this scary computer shop to get it repaired, my dad made me talk to the men for myself. And he wouldn't let them talk back to him as the nice, manly adult. His reply would be, "My daughter is your customer, deal with her." And although that was scary, it was useful skills. And so my second lesson really is that advocacy is a skill that can and needs to be taught over time, and most of us can constantly improve our skills. Now that makes me sound like I'm Superwoman, and I'm not. There are times when I haven't always been able to advocate for myself, even though in hindsight I feel I could have done. For a set of school exams, for example, instead of being scheduled in a separate room where I could use my laptop and have extra time, I was put in random classes, and my laptop had the noisiest keyboard in the world. I mean, I hated it. And on one occasion, I walked into the classroom having lugged my laptop and a printer all the way around school, and this teacher spent 5 minutes shouting at me about how inconvenient me having a laptop in the exam was going to be. So I kind of interpreted that as, you're not allowed to use your laptop. So I attempted to handwrite this exam, which was painful and difficult, and afterwards I kind of complained. And I got told that I hadn't been told I couldn't use my laptop, which was true. I'd never been told you cannot, but I had correctly, socially interpreted that body language and the moaning as refusal. And it gives the teacher plausible deniability. And I'm sure many people here will relate to that. Negative attitudes. The answer is no, but we're meant to go socially. And I learned that successful advocacy is a skill that requires social skills, strengths and interpretations, and how you control and interpret situations. And I made a complaining cripples bingo of lots of different ways that refusal can manifest. And I'll make sure that's put in the chat at some point if someone doesn't get there before me. And in some ways, that experience of the exams meant that we knew we couldn't trust the school. So when I had my actual GCSEs, my parents and I insisted on seeing the room. And when we got there, it was a former boys' toilet, urinals and all, with about an inch of dust all over everything. My mum made it very clear that that room needed to be cleaned ASAP, or she was going to really kick off. And I think lots of us come to what I call lesson 4. You can't trust that access will be provided. So you've got to build in opportunities to verify, and also plans B and plans C. So kind of moving on from my lack of success, one of my first successful advocacy experiences was dealing with the delightful people at the job centre, which I'm sure some of you have already dealt with. After standing in a queue to speak to a reception person, I explained I need a face-to-face appointment to do some forms because, being deaf, phones are really difficult and I can't handwrite very much. The Jobsworth's first response was to point to a bank of phones, which they had in those days, and say, use them. So I reminded him I'd just told him I was deaf and I couldn't use the phone. He then gave me a card and tried to make me use the text phone service. But my experience of the text phone service had been really, really bad. It wasn't answered for weeks. And when it was answered, the person typing on the other end couldn't type. I called him Mr. Can't Type. And when I complained and spoke to his manager, she was just rude. The forms that they did on the phone with me were full of loads of mistakes, which took ages for me to correct. And I nearly got sanctioned for fraud because they'd somehow managed to decide I had 2 children. I did have to point out that was the first I'd heard of it. So I explained this to Mr. Jobsworth, and I said I wasn't asking him to make a decision. I was asking him to call a manager to make a decision, a face-to-face appointment to do some forms. This isn't hard. Nope, he's not having it. He wants me to use the text phone service. So I basically told him about the Disability Discrimination Act, the DDA. And I said I'd disclosed my disabilities and the job centre needs to make reasonable adjustments. The text phone service didn't count. And I'm short, female and white. So I can talk quite loudly and get away with not being seen as a threat. But it makes a bit of a scene, so I did that. And eventually realising that I would just stand there all day, the Jobsworth eventually just asked me, do you phone your bank? And I'm like, you what? No, why? And he went, oh, picks up the phone, phones a manager, and within 5 minutes, I'd seen the manager, I'd been given an appointment for a face-to-face appointment like I wanted, a copy of the forms so I could look at what I needed and fill in what I could, and an apology that I was being asked to wait a whole 5 days. I'm not going to complain about that. So I think that comes to my lesson 5. Often when you're advocating for something, you have to be really, really persistent. You have to get what I call the initial no. But you might have to keep going and making the same argument again and again because they don't want to back down. And the trick is make them realise you're not going away. And kind of following on from that, Ginny mentioned that my first case was taken against HMRC. And I only took that case when I was really desperate because they made a mistake. And in short, HMRC refused to provide me with face-to-face appointments, communication by email, or do anything that was accessible by phone. Their phone lines were constantly blocked. And can you hear me all? Yeah, okay. Their phone lines were constantly blocked, and I only had access to a text phone outside of working hours because they only worked from home. And HMRC's attitude was, well, you're treated the same as everyone else. It's not our fault that you've only got access to a text phone part of the time, which isn't how the law works at all. And I spent 5 years writing letters, putting up with being hung up on, and HMRC basically talking nonsense. And the mistake was basically going to involve £2,000 being taken off me, which I couldn't afford. And after 5 years, I was so angry, I wasn't letting them get away with it. And a friend told me about Conditional Fee Agreement, sometimes slightly inaccurately called no win, no fee. And basically, I was able to find a disability discrimination specialist who'd take my case on. And even with lawyers, HMRC still played games. They delayed, they lied about their mistakes. They tried to trick me into accepting £25 settlement for 5 years of hell. And it took until the day before we went to court before they'd actually do anything in terms of settlement. And they still carried on discriminating. They kept telling me I had to get a hearing person to do my phone calls for me, which I know deaf people get all the time. And they admitted that they didn't answer their text phone when their phone lines were busy, which is indirect discrimination. So I think my lesson 5 is that sometimes with the best will in the world, you won't always be able to succeed, and you may need lawyers or you may need help. And that's not because you did anything wrong. It's because authorities are liars. And my main mistake with HMRC and my first employer was letting things go on for years and years and believing false promises and letting them fob me off. And although in the job case, I don't think the outcome would have changed, I still lost my job. Complaints processes are designed to delay you and tire you out, and they are part of the problem. So my kind of lesson 6, really, as I come to the end of my time, is not to let things go on for too long. I have a simple escalation strategy, and it's really quite simple. Number 1, ask nicely for access. Fair enough. Number 2, repeat my access request more firmly. I might choose to provide more disability disclosure and details. Number 3, if I still don't get access, this is the point where I make it very clear that this is a formal request and I'm not going away. I might cite credible sources, I might get a bit narky. And I make it clear that the next stage is formal legal action. And step number 4 is what's called a letter before action, which you can do without a lawyer and is a legal style letter saying fix the issue, make remedy, probably pay compensation, or I'm going to court to sue you. That's it, really. And sometimes you don't wait for 1, 2, 3, and 4, you skip. And I think all of those things are easier to do in terms of advocacy, whether that's getting professional legal support or having a community when you have support. So one of the things that Doug and Esther and I have done is set up an organisation called Reasonable Access. And at the moment it's tiny, it's just us 3, and we're a bit flaky because disability energy. And it's about thinking of the things that we can do, because there's lots of things involved with, you know, challenging advocacy, you know, technical legal things. What do you do before you get to complaining and legal things? How do you deal with the psychological impacts of constantly being refused access and all the bullshit that we face in trying to advocate for our rights? And kind of created communities of people with a range of different impairments to take different approaches and challenge things. And I know, for example, that I'm better at the pre-legal advocacy. I find the legal stuff really hard to stick with. And although I've done it with lawyers 3 times and as a litigant in person with help from Doug and Esther and others 3 times, and I've got 1 case against PayPal ongoing, my hope is with Reasonable Access, we'll be able to achieve various things. And I'm just going to summarise those before I finish. And I'm hoping more people will know and believe they have rights. And more people will start to ask for their rights and then assert and fight for them. Know what legal and other options are available, and they are limited, but make the best use of what limits there are. Let people know that we're there. Do things like apply for legal aid and getting, you know, more people using those legal methods, or ombudsman, as rubbish as they are, or social media to force access. And then I think that will start to have more organisations realising they need to, you know, actually pay disabled-led experts to improve their services. And due to unmentionable, there's been loads of really good cases lately of people going, you know what, I'm not standing for this anymore. And there's been some really good campaigns, and I think we could do more of that. So, you know, I think people need to know you're not alone, and poor access as something as disabled people is not something we should or are going to tolerate. So I shall finish on my main message being that we all have different journeys, and you can look at someone and say, oh, they're so much better than I'll ever be. But that's not what it's about. It's about us working together as different people with different options and different choices. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you so much, Natalia. That was brilliant. Lovely. Just while you were speaking, we did have some issues with spotlighting and technological problems. So I've now turned off spotlighting, and whoever wants to pin either the interpreter or the speaker can do so by clicking the 3 dots on the top right corner of their image, and you can pin whoever you feel best. Thank you, Natalia. Anna, are you all right carrying on in a minute?
I'm on mute. Yeah, I'm going to wait for Bernadette to pop up when it's time, and then we will swap.
Thank you. Okay, over to Doug. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. That was brilliant, as always. Yeah, so I guess the nature of being disabled is that we all experience barriers, isn't it? We experience problems caused by society's lack of giving us stuff in various different guises. That got translated poorly in the Equality Act to reasonable adjustments. I'm not a lawyer. I have had no legal training. Nothing that I say is legal advice. However, I've honestly lost count of the number of Equality Act and before that Disability Discrimination Act cases I've taken, mostly without representation, 5 or 10 with representation. Hi, Chris. And this Fry is here. He's a solicitor who has worked with me on some of them. But it's a tool more than anything. Quite often I find that disability access cases are dealt with as a customer relations issue. They are not a customer relations issue. We all have this right to reasonable adjustments so that we can take part in society and access everything as easily as possible as anybody else. The problem with the Equality Act is that the only person that can enforce it is the individual disabled person who has faced discrimination in general. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but the general case is that if you've experienced discrimination in some form of service provision, then it is only you, either with or without legal representation, who can take it on and force the providers to change. And I think that's a significant reason why there is so much failure to make reasonable adjustments out there, because the Equality Act was designed, in my view, purposefully with such a poor enforcement mechanism. I mean, expecting the individual disabled people who already experience so many barriers to attempt to take cases through the court system to enforce their rights and to force change in service provision was never going to work as a mainstream concept, I think, in any widespread way. But that said, for some people, it can actually work. And it's not necessarily as difficult or risky as it may appear. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not easy either technically to deal with all the incoming stuff. It's certainly not easy mentally and emotionally. There's a substantial risk that the other side may act in an underhand manner to undermine you. So it can be quite difficult, but it can also be quite a useful tactic, that and media, to get through the ceiling, to get through to the people who actually make the decisions at the top of a company or organization. And it can also put the other side on the back foot because they don't deal with many such cases. I often have found that the managers that I eventually end up dealing with, because of the result of taking legal action or the precursor action, has resulted that the managers have found out about what happens at the coalface and have been surprised and shocked. Some of them, not all of them. But it takes time, it takes emotional energy, it takes spoons, to use the disability colloquialism. And of course, we shouldn't have to do it. And I guess the corollary, I would say, is that we shouldn't feel guilty when and if we don't challenge something that's discriminatory, because we didn't choose to be in this situation in the first place. We didn't choose to have to experience this discrimination, this lack of access. And neither that has the double barrier of the effects of discrimination itself, and then either choosing to fight it, which takes time and energy and headspace and emotional resilience and all the rest of it, or choosing not to fight it, which also takes energy and emotional resilience. And I don't think that we should necessarily feel guilty when we don't fight it. I started using the Equality Act to challenge stuff. It was a Disability Discrimination Act at the time, back in 2002, when I had been challenging a local race provider. I did a half marathon, and I'd written to them multiple times in advance and told them that I would be attending in a wheelchair and asked them if it would be okay, and they never responded, and turned up on the day and said, "You can't possibly do that, health and safety." And their own leaflets hadn't mentioned wheelchairs either. went through the Disability Rights Commission, which tried to reason with them. They didn't engage. And the Disability Rights Commission had a tool at the time that they called, it was a booklet, if you like, what I call the How to Sue Guide. It wasn't actually called that, it had a posher name. But it went through the basics of how to take a case in the small claims track in the county court to enforce your rights to access, or to enforce at least your rights to compensation for the discrimination you faced. And it's not as difficult and scary as it may appear. That is now long gone. The guide, that is, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which replaced the Disability Rights Commission, didn't replace that, that booklet. So I've produced my own. I'm not claiming that it's the be-all and end-all. It isn't. It's out of date. It's a bit basic. Also, it doesn't really take into account the full emotional cost of taking a case. But I'll post a link in the chat shortly to what I call DART, the Disability Attitude Readjustment Tool, which has enabled some people to interface with the process to enforce rights, which is great. I'm a co-trustee of Reasonable Access with Esther and Natalya, which is great. So we're hoping to help reskill, upskill, I don't know, share, peer support people to make more effective complaints, and maybe take legal action either with or without representation, although we don't provide legal advice. I think some of the cases I've taken over the years has been hotels, pubs, train operating companies, student loans companies, cinemas. A couple with Chris, there's Barbican, which was about the ticket pricing, where they charged on balance more for a person attending with a personal assistant or carer than anybody who didn't need such. And most known, I think, for First Bus, which was about the right to expect the bus company to make all reasonable efforts to get people who aren't disabled to shift out of the wheelchair space, so that people who are disabled can get on. The Office of Rail Regulation, I'm currently with them about access to rail replacement vehicles, Department of Transport, North Yorkshire County Council, motorway service stations. The North Yorkshire County Council was a bit different in that I took a transport coordinator, I took a private criminal action against them in an attempt to force them to realise that the home to school buses have to be accessible if anybody pays for the right to travel on it. And I started all of this just by being what I call a reckless have-a-goer. You know, there are some definite risks involved in taking such legal actions, but the financial risks they are a problem, but they can sometimes be managed, or largely be managed, particularly if you take it as a small claims case without legal representation. And you know, this can be an effective extra technique in achieving change for disabled people. So don't discount legal action out of hand, is what I would say, or necessarily think that if you're unable to afford representation or secure representation, that you are unable to enforce your rights. It is possible. It's not easy, but it's probably not as difficult or complicated as most people who haven't gone through it might believe. Esther, who I'm passing over to, has much experience of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was perfect. And now we're going to go straight on to Esther. Esther, your mic is not on, Esther.
Good shout, thank you, sorry. So I'm going to speak about my experience using the law to try to further disability rights in one way or another. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 phases of how I've done that, and then also the kind of pros and cons as I see them of using the law. And so a little bit about me. I'm a full-time power chair user, though currently I'm in my reclining armchair. And I have got reduced use of some bits of my arms, and my impairments affect my organs in lots of ways. And so I have lots of different access needs in different situations. The one that I've taken the most action on is to do with steps into shops. But that's not because that's the only access barrier I face, or like the thing that I think is most important. So, and then kind of two caveats. Firstly, like Doug, not a lawyer, can't give any legal advice. I'm not going to talk about cases that I've got ongoing in any kind of depth at all, because that's frowned upon by judges. And anybody who I've spoken to in probably the last 5 years is not going to learn anything in the next 5 or 10 minutes, because this is just going to kind of skim the surface of the things that I've been thinking about. So this all kind of started off, I had a job working for Citizens Advice Bureau, learnt some about some areas of the law, and was kind of quite effective at helping other people to write letters that resulted in public services listening. And I had some success with that in kind of my personal life and in my friends' lives as well. So I'm the kind of person that people come to, particularly with their social care woes, and I write extremely detailed letters about the council's policy and how they're breaching it, and usually those were quite successful. So that was kind of the beginning of this. I then went to university, and I needed to be able to do my degree over longer than was standard, and Cambridge University at the time was the only university in the country that would not allow that. And I challenged them on that, and eventually won and became the first student there to do that, and now there have been about 50. So I kind of became increasingly aware that there was law, that it was useful, and that in dire straits, when really pushed about something that affected massive amounts of my life, like my ability to do my degree, then it could be something that I would use. But when it came to things like the kind of daily access barriers that I faced, like ramps, I went about things the nice way. I asked nicely and broadly had very little success, and got frustrated. I then came across Doug's guide, and if I'm honest, I took it a little too seriously, and Doug's kind of, this is something that you can do, I very much took to heart. And a street near me where I had been asking for ramps again and again and again over about 10 years, I sent a letter to the Traders Association, said, I want you to sort this. And when they didn't, I then started suing every shop on that street which didn't have a ramp. This is a technique which I really do not recommend. I completely overwhelmed myself. I then had some legal help from lawyers with 2 of the cases, but the rest of the cases on the street I managed myself, and it took several years, most of my life, and I learned an awful lot in doing it, but it's not a technique that I would use again, although it did result in at least 100 ramps in the area of where I live, kind of popping up, because essentially places were suddenly afraid that the law was going to be used. So one of the things that I learned during that was that it was incredibly difficult to use the law, either on your own without a lawyer, or when I was working with a lawyer. Like when I got letters from people about their discrimination, I often found them very distressing, and I found that even excellent lawyers who specialised in this area didn't really have the kind of emotional understanding, and nor was it their job to engage with how I felt about that. And it was made completely different when I engaged with other disabled people like Doug. And so I started organising initially quite informally with other people who were doing this kind of disability rights campaigning using the law. That built up a little bit, and then Doug, Natalia and I put together Reasonable Access, and we've got lots of ideas about what it might become if we get capacity to do it, because it is just us three, but then there are other people who do bits of volunteering for us here and there, but our capacity to coordinate that is also limited. I found things like Natalya's Complaining Cripples Bingo incredibly helpful. Disabled people, some of whom are on this call, turning up at court and just kind of morally supporting me, that completely transformed the experience for me. And so I wanted to make more of that happen. And then I think the other thing that I've got better at as time has gone on is working out, because as Doug says, discrimination is so rife, there's so much of it that you can't take on every case. So over time, I've got better at picking my battles and picking who I'm going to challenge, what I'm going to challenge, and what I'm going to try and get out of that challenge, and trying to get kind of creative settlements out of it. So for example, a court will not usually require a chain to fix all of their chain, and frequently I can get a chain to prove to me that they've made much more widespread change before I'll allow them to pay me off in the form of settlement or compensation. And they will do that because they really, really don't want to go to court, because they know that I will win. And so that can, in some situations, put me in a situation where I'm in a very strong negotiating place. So yeah, I think those are the main things that I was going to say about these kind of three phases that I see as sort of before Mill Road, doing Mill Road, and after Mill Road. Mill Road being the road where I sued every shop and learned many things. So in terms of the pros and cons, I will just run through them kind of quite quickly. So the pros of using the law for disability rights in this way, it involves lots of lone focused work. If you're like, my impairment means that I can't always predict when I'm going to get really good work out, but I can frequently put together letters in the middle of the night or do them in small bits. And it's work that is quite accessible to me because I can do it from home on my own at times that suit me. It's very lone work, and that works for me. If you're the kind of person that likes activist meetings, this is not your kind of jam. If you're the kind of person who writes good technical complaints to like service providers and that kind of thing, you won't find using the law in the small claims court to be all that much different. There's some of it's different, but not all that much. It can result in pushing for wider change, but you have to be quite careful in hoping for that. I think the downsides of it is it can be really scary and overwhelming and technical. There's lots of things to learn, and being in court in front of a judge is inherently scary. Like it's designed to be daunting. It relies on being very, very literate, like being really good at reading and taking in large quantities of information. And if you're not able to do that, there basically is very little help for you. Our kind of peer support network has helped a bit, and we're all good at helping each other to interpret things, but it doesn't fix the problem that, you know, you need to be very literate to do this, particularly without a lawyer. You have to make really difficult decisions where there's no right answer. Sometimes you have to settle a case when you were in the right. Sometimes you have to decide to not carry on something because you haven't got capacity. There's lots of situations which just come down to you, and you are like, the buck stops with you. And that can be really difficult. I find it helpful to have other people to run those decisions past, but it doesn't stop the fact that the buck stops with me. There are really absolute deadlines, like when the court says it has to be done by 4 o'clock, like it basically has to be done by 4 o'clock. And some people can say really horrible things about you, like they appear to think that you get massive amounts of money out of this and that's why you're doing it. For me, this is a tactic which is helpful in some disability rights situations and not in others. And it has pros and cons like all other ways of trying to change the world. So I think those are probably the main things that I wanted to say, but I'd be really happy to answer questions.
Lovely. Esther, that was perfect. Thank you so much. No, all three speeches were really interesting. So now we are going to open up for questions. So if anyone wants to type a question into the chat box, that is probably the best method, and then I can read them out, and Doug, Esther, or Natalia can answer. Or if you're not able to do that, then you can turn on your microphone at an appropriate moment and